Messi, Ronaldo, Michael Schumacher, Usain Bolt, Simone Biles, Roger Federer, Serena Williams, Muhammad Ali, Tiger Woods. Maybe you know many of these incredible athletes. Each one of them at various times have been called the GOAT. That means the greatest of all time. And Daniel chapter 8 presents to us some leaders who also thought of themselves that they were the GOAT, that they were the greatest of all time. One of these people in this chapter is even described as a GOAT. And they were great in some ways. The passage tells us that. But of course they were not the greatest of all time. The title is reserved for someone who is far greater. The one who's behind all of the events of this chapter that we're just about to read. The one that we can depend on in a troubling and terrifying world. So we're going to read just the first 14 verses of this chapter just now. Daniel chapter 8, verse 1 through to 14, and Sheba's going to come and she's going to read for us this morning. Thank you, Sheba.
Daniel chapter 8, 1 to 14. Daniel's vision of a ram and a goat. In the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it changed towards the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came towards the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and towards the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were thrown over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." Here ends the reading. Praise be to God.
Thank you very much, Sheba. In the third year of King Belshazzar, so this is about 550 BC, 550 years before Jesus. A couple of years after what we read in chapter 7, if you were here last week. Daniel said, I, Daniel, had a vision. It was another strange and troubling vision about weird animals, just as Sheba read it from verse 1 through to verse 14. And as we read it, some of the details of that vision are difficult to pin down. But we don't need to wonder what this whole dream is all about. That's because, like as we saw last week, in the second half of this chapter, from verse 15 to the end, this dream was explained to Daniel. This time it was an angel Gabriel who came along and explained the dream to Daniel. He explained how these animals represent two of those world empires that we saw briefly last week as we're looking at. These world empires, they were in Daniel's future from his perspective. They hadn't happened yet. But from our perspective, they're in our past. We can look back at them and see the details of them. So let's just briefly go through some of this strange and weird vision. The first animal Daniel saw was a powerful ram with two horns. Now, according to Gabriel, in verse 20, this represents the kings of Media and Persia. That's the second beast that we saw in chapter 7. The second world empire. And this vision that Daniel got was located in a place called Susa. You'll see it highlighted in red here. That was one of the Persian cities. If you know some of the other stories of the Bible, you'll maybe remember the story of Esther. That was located in Susa, the events of that book. As were Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer in Susa, in the Persian Empire. And history tells us that the Medes and the Persians, a symbol of that empire was a ram. And one of the horns, it says in verse 3, was longer than the other, but grew up later. And that, again, that matches with history because it tells us that the Persians, they rose to power after the Medes, but they were the stronger partners in that empire. And this ram, verse 4, became great. It became great. It was an expansionist empire. Pictured by this ram that charged towards the west and the north and the south, conquering nations and taking over land. But then in Daniel's vision, verse 5, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west. And it attacked the ram and defeated him and trampled on him. And again, we look to the angel Gabriel to tell us what that meant. Verse 21. This is the king of Greece. And the large horn between his eyes is the first king. If you were here last week, we saw that this third beast from Daniel 7 is Greece. And the first king of Greece, the first main leader of the empire of Greece was, of course, Alexander the Great. That's his bust there in the picture. And again, this passage tells us that Alexander, as his name suggests, was great. He became very great, verse 8. He defeated the Persians at the Battle of Issus around 333 BC. So that's about 200 years after Daniel saw this vision. And with great speed, Alexander conquered many nations. So he reigned from Greece right through to India. And it's pictured here in verse 5 as the goat crossed the whole earth without touching the ground. His little legs were going, but he wasn't touching the ground and travelling at great speed. But then after him, verse 8, 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Horns in these visions are often people, they're leaders, they're kings, they're leaders of these empires. And again, Gabriel explained how these represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from the Greek nation. That's because Alexander the Great, he died without leaving any heir. And so for a while there was a lot of conflict within his empire until the empire was split up into 4 different areas, all led by 4 different generals. Now none of these were as powerful as Alexander had been. But one of them was a guy called Seleucus. He reigned in Syria, in Mesopotamia, and in Israel. And out of this empire, verse 9, came another horn, which started small, but grew in power in the south and to the east, and towards what the vision called the beautiful land, which I'm assuming is Israel. And many people understand this horn, again representing one of the leaders, to be a guy called Antiochus the Fourth. He ruled in Greece, in this area, from 175 to 164 BC, so in the 2nd century BC. We're moving down through history. And like the Persians and like Alexander, he too was great in a way. In fact, 4 times in this chapter, the verb to be great is applied to him. It's emphasized. For example, if you look at verse 11, that's the horn, set itself up to be as great as the Prince of the host. To be as great as God. In fact, history tells us that on coins minted in that time period, Antiochus gave himself the name Antiochus Epiphanes. He added that as a kind of nickname for himself. Why? Because Epiphanes means something like God manifest. He really thought of himself as the GOAT, the greatest of all time. But all these empires, they weren't just tremendous in their power and their might. These empires were also terrifying. It's easy to read this and not get the impact of this. But at the end of this experience, at the end of seeing this vision, Daniel, it says, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. It made him sick. It impacted him so deeply. Now, in part that was meeting this angel, Gabriel, but mainly it was the horror of what he'd seen and the meaning of what it meant. That included the violence of this ram, the Medes and the Persians, as it spread out its empire. And the furious attack of the goat on it, as it just destroyed it, as the Greek Empire took over and spread out. But I think it was especially because of that final king and the violence of his reign, especially his attack on the Jewish people, on Daniel's people. Because this passage predicted how Antiochus would oppose God in a brutal way. It highlights some of the things that he did. How he ordered the eradication of worship in the temple. It took away the daily sacrifice, verse 11. This is what Antiochus did. He banned the Jewish people from worshipping in their temple. And then he desecrated that temple. The place of the sanctuary was brought low, verse 11. Antiochus went in and plundered it. Then he rededicated God's temple to the worship of Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, and to just express his own power and to impact everybody else, he offered pigs on the altar, an unclean animal in the Jewish understanding. He offered them on the altar, which is called the abomination that causes desolation. We'll see that later in Daniel, and Jesus also referred to that. But Antiochus was also brutal in the murder of thousands of people. Verse 24 says he will cause astounding devastation. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. In one attack, over, I think it was 3 days, 40,000 Jewish people were killed. 10,000 of them were taken captive. This was a brutal genocide and horrific ethnic cleansing. For Daniel, I think it must have been a bit like, I don't know if you've ever seen the film Saving Private Ryan. If you've seen those opening scenes of the storming of the beaches in northern France, just filmed just along the road in Caraclot, it's impactful and it stays with you and it makes you sick to your stomach when you watch it. I think that's what it was like for Daniel as he watched this vision, this horrific prophecy of what was going to happen. So no wonder Daniel wrote this. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. And I think as we read it, it should impact us too. Yes, it's easy to read the Bible on a Sunday morning like this and just close the Bible and just go on with everyday life. But this should impact us. When Jesus approached Jerusalem, it says in Luke chapter 19, he wept over it. Why did he weep over it? Because he knew the suffering, the devastation that was about to come on them. And we too should care about this, the reality that is part of our world. Whether we think about the distant past, like the brutality and the violence of the Persians and the Greek Empire, or we think about our more recent past, people like Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot and Mao, or we think about the present, as we watch the news or search through the internet and see similar brutality and violence all around our world today. But also as we think towards our future. This is what Gabriel said to Daniel. Understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. So this is an area that Christians disagree on. So if you have a different understanding, that's fine. I'm not going to fall out with you. I'm not going to try and impose it on you. We can disagree, okay? But many Christians believe that Antiochus IV, this guy who set himself up and caused this incredible violent genocide against the Jews, he is a type, a preview of somebody who's going to come in the future, at the end. As we were thinking about last week, the one who's called it by John the Antichrist, or by Paul as the man of lawlessness, or in Revelation, the beast, or in Daniel chapter 7, the little horn. And Antiochus is a type of that man because he's kind of the opposite of who Jesus is. We don't have time to go into all the details of that, but just think about it for a minute. So instead of setting himself up like Antiochus did, Jesus humbled himself. Instead of causing deceit to prosper, trampling down truth, as Antiochus did, Jesus came as the truth. Instead of taking away the sacrifices and banning them like Antiochus did in Jerusalem, Jesus came as the ultimate sacrifice for our sins. Instead of desecrating the temple with that horrific act of sacrificing pigs on the altar, Jesus came as the ultimate temple, the ultimate meeting place between God and men. And instead of murdering God's people, like Antiochus did, Jesus came to save God's people. Antiochus is a type, a picture of the Antichrist. The one who's the exact opposite of who our Lord is. So thinking about these things should impact us. We should have that softness of heart to care for those who will suffer, whether it impacts us or not directly. But we don't need to stay overwhelmed by this. That's because although tremendous in power and terrifying in violence, all of these human empires are temporary. Did you notice this? How, as we read, as Sheba read to us, each of these empires are described as if they are indestructible until they're suddenly destroyed. The Persian ram, verse 4, no animal could stand against him until the Greek goat attacked him and destroyed him. Now, that goat was undefeatable until at the height of his power, the large horn was broken off. And again, history tells us that Alexander the Great, he was only 32 years old when he suddenly died. And even this final horn, the one that prospered in everything he did, would not survive forever. Verse 25, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Details of Antiochus' death are kind of debated, but it seems that he suddenly was hit by a terrible illness and died in absolute agony. So despite how great these kingdoms were, each of them came to a rapid end. Human power can be great, but it doesn't last. Not the superpowers of the past or the present or the future. So we don't need to despair when we see evil prosper in this world. This helped a guy called Asaph, who wrote a psalm, very famous psalm, Psalm 73. He nearly stumbled when he saw the prosperity of the wicked. He saw evil people seem to prosper in this world, and he nearly lost his faith until he realized how suddenly they are destroyed. And that will happen to every person who sets himself up against God today. So that's the so-called greatness of human empires. But in contrast, in this passage, we see the true greatness of God. We can see this in his prophecy. This passage is an incredible demonstration of God's foreknowledge. This was God revealing to Daniel what will happen later in the time of wrath, hundreds of years before it happened. Hundreds of years. And it happened just as God said. In fact, Daniel chapter 8 is such a clear and accurate representation of the rise and fall of all of these empires that skeptics, they read this and they claim, well, Daniel must have written this book well after all of these events. He couldn't have lived in the time he claimed to. It must have been written after these events, and they were looking back because it's just too accurate. Nobody could be that accurate. Well, nobody apart from God. Because for us, this fulfilled prophecy, as we read through Daniel chapter 8, is another proof of the reliability of the Bible. This book is true. It's accurate. It is always trustworthy. God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? So we can look back and see that this is prophecy that's been fulfilled in incredible detail. But for Daniel and his people, of course, all of this prophecy was still pointing to the future. So what use was it to them? Well, knowing this would help them to be better prepared for the future. These terrifying events wouldn't take God by surprise. And so through this prophecy, it didn't need to take them by surprise either. Like, imagine this. Imagine that you know that someone is hiding around the corner, ready to jump out at you, to give you a fright. Boom! Imagine that. But imagine you know that that person is there. Would the shock and the panic when it happens be the same? Well, of course not. If you know it's coming, then most of the shock and the panic is gone. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. Jesus believed this. Before it happened, Jesus told his disciples how he would be arrested and condemned and crucified. He told them how they would be persecuted. And he told them about all of the conflicts that would happen in this world before he would come back again. This wasn't to depress them. It wasn't to fill their hearts with fear. But rather it was to prepare them so that they could cope when it happened. This is what Jesus said, John chapter 16. All this I have told you so that you will not go astray. Prophecy tells us that God knows what will happen in this world. So we don't need to panic when it does. It also shows that God has a purpose in this. These evil men did what they wanted. But God was in control here. As a young man, Daniel declared this about God. He sets up kings and he deposes them. Chapter 2. And he accomplishes his purposes through this. For example, his judgment on the evil king Belshazzar came through the rise of the Medes and the Persians as they took over Babylon. And then it was Cyrus, the great Persian king, who decreed that the Jewish people could go back to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. I think God also prepared for the preaching of the gospel of Jesus through the spread of the Greek language under Alexander the Great. It meant that this language was used by so many different nations around. This is why our Bible, our New Testament, was written in Greek. And he also provided a preview of the future through Antiochus and what he did. So God is not the source of evil, but he uses evil for his good purposes. Do you remember Joseph saying this to his brothers about their evil actions? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. And the ultimate example of this, of course, is the cross, where evil men did what they wanted, but the apostles prayed to God that they did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. God has a purpose in the suffering in his world. God has a purpose in our suffering. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. And so the one who's in control of all of this is God. No matter how powerful these empires become, God is more powerful. That's especially emphasized in this passage about this guy Antiochus. This evil man would only be able to do what he did, these horrific things, as long as God allowed him to. The angel revealed, verse 14, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. There was a time limit on this. Now there's debates about what this actually means. Some people measure the 2,300 days from Antiochus' first incursion into Jerusalem to the rededication of the temple under Judas Maccabeus. If you know about the Maccabean revolt, that's what that time period is all about. Others take it to be 2,300 evenings and mornings. That's 1,150 days, evening and morning sacrifice each day. And they time that from the desecration of the temple to the rededication of it. So there's different ways to time this, but whatever one you want to choose, they both fit. And we know that this prophecy was fulfilled. Because the feast of dedication, or Hanukkah, is a celebration of this rededication. And in John chapter 10, Jesus attended that feast, giving his approval to the celebration of this rededication, to the fulfillment of this prophecy. Interestingly, it was on that day that Jesus stood and declared, I and the Father are one. The Jews thought he was committing the same blasphemy as Antiochus did when he declared himself to be God manifest. But we know that Jesus was just telling the truth of his true identity, don't we? He truly is Emmanuel, God with us. But the key point is that God is in control of all of this. This happened when God decided, because Antiochus will be destroyed, it said, but not by human power. God will tell him when time's up. This chapter may be a demonstration of the terrible power of human beings, but over them all is the wonderful power of God. But finally, in contrast with all of these temporary human empires, God's kingdom is permanent. I think that's the emphasis throughout this book. Do you remember last week we saw where one like the Son of Man, picture of Jesus, he has an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. But Daniel, he's already declared this in chapter 2 of his book. Then Nebuchadnezzar declared that same truth in chapter 4 of his book. And then Darius, he also declared that in chapter 6. God's kingdom is permanent. And I think this is why, after this vision, Daniel was able to write, then I got up and went about the king's business. This vision, it impacted him emotionally and physically. And he still couldn't understand it all. But he knew that whatever happened, God was still sovereign over everything. So because of that, he could get up and go back to work for King Belshazzar. He could go back to work and serve his Lord. And in this world, this messed up, horrific, violent, terrifying world, we can do the same. In all of the tumultuous events that we can see, we can be sure that God is on the throne. So we can keep getting up and going about our King's business. We can keep on serving our Lord. When Paul wrote about the coming resurrection, When Jesus was going to come back and all of those who are in Christ will rise and meet with him in the air to the Corinthians. When he wrote about that, his final exhortation was this. Therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labour in the Lord is not in vain. Looking at prophecy shouldn't lead us to idle speculation and discussions and arguments and all that stuff. Rather, it should lead us to passionate and committed service for our King. This is a strange and disturbing vision. Highlights the tremendous and terrifying power of great men. But we don't need to be overwhelmed. We can trust in God because his prophecy is true. So we can be prepared. His promises are sure, even if we can't see them. His power is insurmountable, even if it seems the wicked are prospering. And his kingdom is permanent. And so our commitment to him can be too. Our God is the greatest of all